Tetrachords. Thinking in terms of tetrachords can be useful for a lot of reasons. It can help us think more compartmentally about scales, melodies, solos, etc. They're a way of breaking down scales into medium-sized components with fewer possibilities, and they reveal a lot of the musical relationships that exist in the scales we commonly employ in music, which then allows us to use those relationships to our advantage. Here's a major scale. There's a few ways we commonly think about its structure. On the macro level, we can think about it as a whole unit. On the micro level, we can think about the particular sequence of whole and half steps that make it up. 2 whole steps, a half step, 3 whole steps, and another half step. Another good way of looking at it is to think about the interval between the root and every other note in the scale. So a major second, major third, perfect fourth, perfect fifth, major sixth, major seventh, and a perfect eighth or an octave. This is how I often think about scales because it's especially revealing when comparing the structure of a given scale to that of all its modes. But we can also split it into 2 tetrachords. A tetrachord is just 4 notes separated by 3 intervals. Traditionally, tetrachords span a perfect fourth, but that's a pretty old school idea. A tetrachord can actually be any 4 notes, but generally we think of them as 4 consecutive notes of a scale. Starting at the root, we have 2 whole steps followed by a half step. Starting at the 5th, we have 2 whole steps followed by a half step. The same thing. So this, you could call a major tetrachord. What's interesting here is that if you take this out of context of the scale we were just looking at, it sounds like F is the root, or the tonic. And here's an F major tetrachord down here. So an F major scale. So if we consider the circle of fifths or fourths, whatever you want to call it, every major key is comprised of 2 major tetrachords that are rooted right next to each other on the circle, such as F and C. But there are lots of other possible types of tetrachords, some, of course, more commonly used than others. We've looked at major tetrachords so far. A minor tetrachord would be a whole step, a half step, and a whole step. Consider the first 4 notes of a minor scale. Now, despite what you may expect, 2 minor tetrachords separated by a whole step do not make a minor scale. They actually make the Dorian mode. The upper tetrachord of a minor scale is a half step followed by 2 whole steps. You could call this an upper minor tetrachord because it's the upper part of the minor scale. Or you could call it a Phrygian tetrachord because it's the first tetrachord of the Phrygian mode. Although curiously enough, the Phrygian mode is made up of 2 Phrygian tetrachords. I think I prefer calling it the Phrygian tetrachord in that case. Okay, let's take stock. Major tetrachord equals 2 whole steps, then a half step. Minor tetrachord equals a whole step, a half step, and a whole step. Phrygian tetrachord equals a half step and 2 whole steps. That's every combination of 2 whole steps and a half step. By pairing these in different ways, you can construct a lot of different scales and modes. For instance, major plus minor equals the Mixolydian mode. Minor plus major equals the melodic minor scale. But I'm not just going to sit here and spew off all possible combinations. That's for you to explore. If we branch out a little, we can do things like a half step, 1.5 steps, and a half step. This you would probably call a harmonic tetrachord because it's the top chunk of the harmonic minor scale. Or maybe a tetrachord of 3 whole steps in a row. I think this would most commonly be called a Lydian tetrachord because it's the first 4 degrees of the Lydian mode. Although this throws off our scheme a little bit because now we're spanning over a perfect fourth. 3 whole steps span an augmented fourth, which means to fit in an octave, we need to compensate by separating our tetrachords by a half step instead of a whole step. Anyway, I'm throwing a lot of information at you. What can you do with all this? I always say to my private students, to get really good at playing music, you need to understand it from as many different angles as possible. This is just a way of looking at things, and it reveals a lot of relationships you might not otherwise notice. And there's so much you can do when you think in chunks like this. Like I pointed out earlier, you can imply a tonal center. If you're improvising, try limiting your note choices to the lower tetrachord of whatever key you're in. See how much you can say with just those 4 notes. Try to hear where each note wants to pull you. As you build the intensity, step out, go into the upper tetrachord. There are far fewer intervallic structures you can build by limiting yourself to 4 notes spanning about a fourth, as opposed to 7 in a full heptatonic scale. Find the tonal implications that are living inside those familiar scales and modes. And to wrap up, I'll show you a cool thing you can do. Remember how I said major scales are made of 2 major tetrachords separated by a whole step? If I play a C tetrachord, followed by a G tetrachord, I've made a C major scale. Now I'll go 1 notch further on the circle of fifths with a D tetrachord. Then another with an A tetrachord, an E tetrachord, etc. I ran out of space. This is a crazy sound all combined. What holds it together is that every pair of tetrachords makes up a major scale, but by stringing them together according to the circle of fifths, you end up with this crazy constantly modulating scale that's not really a scale, but more of a sound. There's a bunch of different ways to do things like this. Like if you string together a bunch of Lydian tetrachords in the same way, you get what Jacob Collier calls the super ultra hyper mega meta Lydian scale. But again, it's not a scale, it's just a sound. And it's a technique you can use to sort of step out from the chords you're playing over. It makes you go against the harmony, but you get to that area in a seamless way. Anyway, there's a lot of exploration to be done here, and I try to be conscious of these relationships in all my practicing as much as possible. So take what you know, dissect it, see what cool things you can find. After all, a huge part of developing a voice on your instrument is playing and exploring and being curious. Recognizing and understanding relationships, knowing what's possible, they're all good things, and they're just going to make you better. So I hope that gives you enough to chew on. Have fun with it, and thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.